Welcome to Inside Audit, IIA Belgium's podcast. In 2021, the IIA started with research and benchmarking as input for the revision of the IPPF. 3 years, countless working groups, 1,600 completed surveys, 19,000 specific comments, and 120 pages later, we have reached one of the most important milestones of the profession in the past decades. Since January the 9th, the global internal audit standards are published, and they will become effective 12 months later. Because of the significance of this milestone, we will dedicate 5 episodes of this podcast, one for each domain of the standards, with our 3 distinguished guests. Welcome to the latest episode about the internal audit standards, where we delve into the world of performing internal audit services. We still have our 3 distinguished guests, Kathleen, John, and Nicolas. For the last time, welcome to the podcast. Kathleen, in this area, we do no longer make a distinction between assurance and advisory services. Advisory services are totally different from assurance functions. So do we need the same requirements for both types of engagements?
Well, as you know, Cedric, one of the objectives of the new global internal audit standards was to raise the bar for the profession. And I think that this decision fits really into raising the bar for the profession. So the intent there was to have this project-based systematical approach as well for assurance as for advisory engagements. However, seeing the comments coming in during the exposure period, the Standards Board did realize that this is probably not only practical, but also probably not feasible all the time. So you will see that now in the new standards, there is again a distinction between advisory and assurance engagements. So you will see that in specific requirements and specific standards, there is a call out again where they mention that these requirements are not applicable. For instance, I'm thinking about risk assessments, developing criteria. These are probably things that are not relevant for typical advisory engagements. There is also more clarifications on what we understand in terms of advisory engagements. So in the glossary, there is a clear definition with some examples, so including the typical engagements to provide advice, but also the engagements to create awareness, to give training. Also, forensic services are included there. And I think that in particular for training and forensic services, it does not make sense to have the typical requirements of assurance engagement applicable for these type of engagements.
Kathleen, the new internal audit standards are also much more flexible regarding the use of recommendations versus action plans. Why are the new standards less strict on this topic?
I'm not sure whether the new standards are less strict. In my opinion, it's more addressing the evolving needs of the internal audit profession. What do you intend to do there with your recommendations and your findings? That is that management takes them up, that they do something with that. So whether you produce them in terms of recommendations or that you skip that phase and immediately go into discussion with your management to take action, that's probably something that depends on your relation that you have with your senior management. The key is probably how do you communicate in the best way to have impact and to address those things that you want to address with senior management. So for me, it's more a question on the type of communication rather than just saying, okay, it needs to be a recommendation or it needs to be an action plan.
Nicola, how important is this distinction between a recommendation and an action plan?
Yeah, maybe let me first react on what Kathleen said, because I was quite surprised when I read the comments on the public exposure on the draft standards, and I didn't fully understand what was the issue in having to issue recommendation. Probably also because it's the framework I have known all my professional life in my various positions. It was always findings leading to recommendation, leading to action plan. The difference between the two, the recommendation, the owner, that is the internal audit. You issue a recommendation, you're kind of instructing the auditee to deal with the finding, to deal with the risk you have identified. And because, as the saying goes, there is more than one way to skin a cat, the business, the auditees, might come with one or more action plan. Also, it depends on your auditees. In some cases, you want to be in the recommendation quite vague enough, so has to leave leeway to the business to say, how am I going to address that? In other cases, you have to be very, very specific, because otherwise they might decide on an action plan which will not address the issue. And in some cases, I've seen that on recently, they might need guidance. And then you might draft a recommendation which help them to, after that, develop their action plan. My take on that, but I will see in the future how we work with that. I feel that the standards on that part have been a bit watered down, less strict if you want. We plan to keep our framework, which is finding, recommendation, action plan, and we see value in that. And also there are different moments of discussions with the business. So you have, for example, a meeting when you discuss the finding and do you agree with the severity and the finding. And if you're, then you move to the next phase, which what we would as internal audit recommend. And do you agree with that or not? And then, well, please come back with an action plan. Now, I'm still debating. So if people are listening, they have another opinion and they see me in one of the events of IA Belgium, please come and we can talk about it. I'm on the fence on that one. I'll say that.
But it's not that you cannot develop your recommendations and then your action plan. It's still allowed. It just gives a bit more, I would say, the choice to the chief audit executive on how he or she thinks that she has the most impact in communicating the results, right?
I think it makes a difference because one chief audit executive may feel better by throwing the recommendation over the fence and leaving it there. And the other one wants to report to his board the finding, the recommendation or proposed action, but also the agreed action with due date and own-up. And I believe very much in the last, because I think it's the only way to show effectiveness of our function. And before I became internal auditor, I was a few years regulator with the Dutch Central Bank, supervising a large bank. And there I saw in the follow-up monitoring papers that there were recommendations issued every year after year, the same recommendation. And that was the moment that I promised myself to never do that. And it works well so for 25 years to just only report with agreed action plans, owners and due dates. That also enables you to do much more effective follow-up monitoring.
And what should the auditor do if it's not possible to agree on a reasonable action plan or a reasonable due date?
Yeah, I think you have to escalate. Our policy is that we do the most we can to agree. But if not, and we feel it's important enough, if it's not really material, we can maybe choose an alternative ourselves. But if we feel it's material, it has to go to the next higher level and up to the audit committee if it's really a critical point. But in practice, I must say that because they know we will do that, it rarely happens.
Okay. Now, Nicolas, taking a step back, before we can actually agree on an action plan, internal auditors need to identify the root cause of a finding. In your experience, is it always feasible to get to the actual root cause in an audit?
Well, let's be honest, I don't think it is. In most cases, yes, and ideally we should always be able to find a root cause, but in practice, we know, I think we've all been there, that sometimes it's not possible. And it can be for various reasons, because the issue is very, very complex, because there are multiple parties involved and it's difficult to determine who is responsible. It can also be the experience or the inexperience of your audit team. That can also happen. They don't have the maturity yet to really drill down on the root cause. So not always, but in most cases, we should be able to. The question I'm asking myself in such a case where we are not able to identify the root cause, is that not the symptoms of another issue? And I think that's the question where we should answer that. It's a very important topic because if you look at training programs, both from the IIA and the IA Belgium, we have specific training on root cause analysis. So it shows that for the profession, it is a very important element. But again, that's what I would recommend. If you can't determine a proper root cause, fine, ask yourself, why is that?
I think I agree with you, Nicolas, on the feasibility. It might not always be feasible to look for the root cause. However, I do think it's necessary to look for it and to take that effort together with your management probably. Because if you don't address a root cause, you will see recurring things. And what is then the added value of addressing a recommendation and action plan if you are not addressing the real root cause? You will probably find the same things in your next audit. So I do think that at least the effort should be there to look for that.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I will even add to not forget the cultural and behavioral part of that. Because many times we stop with the symptom, but the real root cause is a lot of times in the behavior of people.
Kathleen, something else then, ratings and rankings are made mandatory in the standards. What's the purpose of this practice?
Well, that's actually a misunderstanding that already started during the exposure of the draft version. Rating and rankings were mentioned in the requirements, but not as the only option to do what you need to do, and that is prioritizing. This is really the underlying idea here, that you have to prioritize and make it clear what are the most significant things that you have found in your audit, whether it is a finding or a recommendation, to provide for information on what to address first so that your senior management can prioritize on that. So I would say the intent there is to clarify the significance of findings and recommendations, and therefore you can use a rating or a ranking, but it's not mandatory. And now we have moved that to the considerations to make it very clear that it is not a requirement, but it's more a good practice, I would say, a way that you can do that. But the chief audit executive can decide to do it in another way, as long as it's clear what are the most significant things that you have found in your audit.
John, if it's not exact ratings or rankings, how can internal auditors achieve their objectives in another way?
That is a difficult one, but things that I used are thumbs up or thumbs down. And when I started as internal auditor, I only had adequate and inadequate. But then to go with the flow, we added more. But if you look at how it is used in practice, the top one and the bottom one are never used. We always are in the middle. And when I started at Euroclear, we had 5, and then in the middle it was yellow. And then my management at some point said, we are in the yellow trap because you are not making choices. You always end at yellow. And then we went back to 4, because then at least you have to make the choice between number 2 and 3, which comes back to my original thought, adequate, inadequate.
Yeah, I have to say that I was really surprised by the comments on that aspect, even more than the ones on the distinction between finding, recommendation, action plan. Especially because if I recall, one of the summary of the comments was that some internal auditors felt it difficult to discuss rating or rankings with auditees in conflict. And I don't think that's a good reason enough to not have rating, rankings, whatever, prioritization. If you spoke about colors, to me, that's also a ranking. If you have a green, yellow, red, that's a ranking. It's 1, 2, 3, doesn't matter. And I would make the link with something we discussed earlier in another podcast, which is professional courage. To me, an internal auditor should have the courage to determine a rating, a ranking, and defend his or her position with the business. The business might disagree, but I think that's internally should be able to defend that. It's also, do you have a risk management function in your organization? And I would think that if you have, there should be some alignment in the way you address and you report risks and findings, because other way you will have one framework for the second line about risk and another one for internal. And I've had that. And then I remember I think it was the management committee that told us, but what is this? Because we have one type of reporting for the second line with a certain framework and another one from internal audit, and it doesn't match up. External auditors, they use ranking in their management letters. They have findings, recommendation, and they have either it's a color code or either it's a ranking, like a low, medium, high. I'm very surprised again by the comments from the community. If the reason, as it was stated in the disposition of comments, if the reason is that it leads to uncomfortable conversation with auditees, to me, that's not a good reason enough to not have those rating or rankings. If there are other reasons, well, I'm open for discussion.
Okay. And now we are at a point in the process where we have world-class internal audit observations. We identified the root cause. We agreed on an action plan. And then it comes to the follow-up monitoring. John, why is that so important?
Follow-up monitoring is first of all important for the company, because it shows the utilization of improvement potential, which they have to monitor after reading our reports. But it also is important for us because it's at the end the effectiveness of the internal audit function. You're right. What is the use of writing all these reports with action plans if they are not done? So I think it's about effectiveness and using of improvement potential. And then, of course, who is responsible for that? It's the auditee. And we are there to help them come up with the right solution, but they have to put it in. And our role is to quarterly or whatever frequency you use, report on the progress and give early warning signals when things are not going the right way. And in doing that, we use also rating and color coding for that. in which blue means that everything is done, celebrate. Green is going well. And then we have 2 colors for delays. Amber is a delay for which there is a valid reason. The auditee is doing everything he can, but something is blocking him, which he cannot influence. And red are the ones where there's not enough attention or any reason that is not valid. And those are the ones we list even to the audit committee and to management to make sure that they get into additional action to get it done. I always say to my audit committee, a bad audit rating is not so bad if the follow-up monitoring after that is positive. And I think that is showing the importance of follow-up monitoring.
I fully agree with that, John. I think that the action plans and the monitoring of the action plan is where you really have an impact. Without that, it's just the last chain, but it's the most crucial one. Without that, you will not have an effective internal audit function.
And you partially mentioned it already, John, but it's of course the auditee that is responsible for implementing it. But overall, who's responsible for that follow-up process? Should that always be internal audit?
No, not always. I think there are companies in which the second line has also a system of follow-up, even broader than the ones that internal audit is performing follow-up. I think a number of years ago, we had a position paper drafted together with the ECB, in which they asked, at least in the financial sector, to have internal audit follow-up on their own agreed actions on the ones with the external auditor and the regulators. So that's what in the financial sector is quite normal. But of course, there can be self-identified improvements and things coming from compliance and risk management that will go into a big system. So I don't think we have the number of the preferred position there. But I think looking at the audit committee, they are very much interested in this report.
Kathleen, regarding the engagement conclusions, the new standards moved from opinion to conclusion. Is it just linguistics or is there a difference? And is it a sensitive change?
I think that this one mainly came from a language perspective. I think that opinion in different languages has maybe a negative connotation. Also, it's probably more referring to something that might be personal and not objective, which is definitely something that we do not mean. So I think that conclusion better covers what we intend to say, because it is indeed in conclusion. It's a statement based on all your overall findings. So I think that the language is now much more clear to say what it intends to say. And no, I don't think that it was a hot potato that we had to address there. I think it was more a language issue.
All right, that brings me to the conclusion of this final episode about the internal audit standards. And as a conclusion, there is no right or wrong, at least not at this table, on the use of recommendations versus action plans. A color code or a thumbs up is also considered a ranking. And 4 options might be better than 5 because it pushes you to make at least a decision if it's good, less good or bad in this case. And the follow-up monitoring is a crucial step in the audit process to make sure all the added value that was created by internal audit gets actually implemented. So for the last time, thank you very much to all my guests. It was a pleasure of having you here. It's a small world, so even though, Kathleen, you're in the United States, John is traveling between the Netherlands and Belgium. I'm sure we'll meet again soon, as well as with many of our listeners. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
And if you want to know more about this topic, you can go to iaabelgium.org or theiaa.org to stay tuned for the latest news around this topic. Thank you very much.